Okay guys, a warm welcome back to the Forensics Detailing channel. Do not forget to subscribe. I want to cover the subject of picking your first polisher or understanding machine polisher types. So, when you're new to detailing and you want to take the plunge to polishing your car, you want to feel like you're going to use the machine which is going to give you the best results, and you don't want to feel like you're missing out on any capability or performance. Now, the first thing you need to understand is really, no matter which machine type you pick, whether it's a dual action free spinner, forced rotation dual action, or a rotary polisher, your quality of results are going to really depend on you and your approach to that task. Okay, it's true. So you can do just as good work essentially on an entry level dual action polisher as you could on the top of the range rotary, but it might take you a bit longer, or there might be some constraints around what you can access. Okay, so let's cover the three different types of polishers first of all. Now, the first type of polisher is the free spinning dual action polisher. So essentially, this machine drives an axle inside here. So it spins just like an axle on a drill, it spins. But in that axle, you can see it there, the bearing which the plate is mounted on is not in the center, obviously. It's mounted on an offset, and that offset means that the plate is rotating around an orbit and then spin is generated, okay? So the spin creates the biggest movement of the abrasive. That turning transports the abrasive on the surface more than the tiny little orbit, obviously. But the spin isn't driven, it's a bearing. So if you put too much pressure down on this machine, you'll stop the rotation and you'll only have a tiny oscillation or orbit, and you won't be getting much work done. If you go over a raised edge, the pressure that's created will stop the plate from spinning, and you'll just be doing the tiny orbit. If you go into a valley that's bigger than the pad sort of gets wedged a little bit into the valley, and you can stall out the machine. That's the disadvantage of the dual action polisher. You also can't edge so precisely with it, because if you've got the machine on a panel and you're polishing and you want to go up to an edge, sometimes you want to kind of lean in a little bit and you're not going to be horizontal to the panel. If ever you do that on a dual action polisher, you will stop the spin generally, okay? And you'll just be using the orbit. So those are the disadvantages with the free spinning dual action polisher. Not quite as aggressive for me in practical terms. It can cut fine, but it's more prone to being inconsistent on the panel, and you have to sometimes accompany these with other tools so that inconsistency is less noticeable. For example, on a really curvy front bumper, a large pad is going to stall out a lot. If there's a lip on the bumper and you're trying to polish that little lip there, it's going to stall, whereas the other formats won't. So you get the idea there. Now, here's something to consider as well. The offset, or the throw, is the distance from the center of the bearing to where the free spinning bearing is mounted, okay? The longer that distance, the bigger the orbit, and generally the more aggressive the machine is. So you get a slight increase in capability or cut. Very hard to measure actually, but it's probably there. So entry-level machines like this into detailing DA9 have a relatively standard orbit size of 8 or 9 millimeter, 9 in this case. That slower orbit would mean it's less aggressive, you're going to generate less heat, but perhaps you're down a little bit on cut on the sort of long throw machines that have a 15 mil throw potentially, or 12 mil throw, a longer throw. So this machine here is perhaps the first machine that you would look to buy to start polishing. They're cheap. I believe it's not much more than £100 or something. I'll link all these machines in the description, all of them. That's the advantage. If you buy one and later on you want to move on, they make a good backup machine if you're a professional. So if any of your main machine breaks, you can still carry on, which is important. But you can also sell them on eBay, and they sell for like 70, 80 quid if you keep them nice and clean. So you can experience a really good polisher for not a lot of money and get rid of it once you're ready to move on. The ergonomics of these machines have improved over the years now. They have integrated bales, and very few people use the stick or the D handle because you can hold the machine perfectly adequately with just the shell and that bale. It's fine. The disadvantage as well of this machine is it doesn't have a trigger, it has a latch start, and you sort of set your speed down here, which is not as good ergonomics as some of the more expensive machines we're going to show you. These machines nowadays have more powerful motors, so they're less prone to stall. You have to be a bit more careful with the older machines when they were on like 600 watt motors, whereas these now come with 750 watt motors or different gearings, better motors where you can really crank them up to the point where you can use them quite aggressively and push in. But generally, you want to keep your speed set to a speed where the plate isn't stalling easily when you're just moving it around on friendly flat surfaces. So there you go. The other advantages of these entry-level DAs is you can take that plate off and put a 3-inch plate on it and use that to polish your bumper or smaller areas, so you can swap the plates. Okay, 99% of people starting polishing will use a machine like that. Really good starting point. The quality of the work you can deliver is as good as any of these machines. Like I said, it might just take you a little bit longer to get there. The next option for you, and perhaps the most popular option that lots of people look to take, is a pair of dual action polishers. So you'll have, we'll just take this cordless one. We'll have a long throw dual action polisher, cordless or cord lid. We'll talk about that a bit later on. So a longer throw, a bit more aggressive, with a large size pad, and then they'll combo that up with a mini dual action polisher that could be a 3-inch polisher, like this one here. I've left the pad on that, naughty boy. Or it could be a cordless 3-inch, like this one here. That just saves you time if you're a professional. So you're going from, taking that plate off and putting another plate on can take a lot of time. The 3-inch size is kind of ideal for doing a wing. It's ideal for doing a door mirror. It's ideal for doing a front bumper. It's decent for doing pillars. It's good for doing lower seals, whereas the big plate isn't. So you don't really want to be taking plates off if you're working to time pressure. So having two machines is a great option. That's the next step up, okay? Is that next step up where you have two machines really for professionals only? No. I mean, it's up to you, isn't it? It's up to budget and stuff like that. If you're polishing lots of cars, after a while, you'll realise how handy a 3-inch mini is. Now, that pretty much covers all of your polisher, your dual action polishers, apart from the nano ones. We won't talk about nano polishers in this video because they're a little bit of an exception to the rule, good for interiors, tiny areas. Now we're going to move on to the next type of polisher. Well, in fact, no. We're going to move on to the next type of polisher, but we're going to make that polisher the rotary polisher. Now, the rotary polisher tends to be used by body shops. The rotary polisher mechanically is very simple. You've got a motor driving a shaft that's geared to then drive the axle that way. That gearing is important because it's relevant to how much torque this thing kicks out and how fast it can go. Now, the rotary polisher is just really a rotation of the axle. Okay, it's fixed rotation. When the machine's on, it's driving it. You will not stop the rotary polisher unless you're really strong. You're doing something crazy. I don't think you can slow them down a little bit, but you'll never stop them. Now, because there isn't two forms of movement, you can work the abrasive very rapidly with quite a lot of energy when you're using the rotary, especially when you're leaning in with the rotary, where you're working and that pressure is on that particular point. You're going to work that area quite hard and aggressive, and because it's really moving the abrasives quite a large distance and it's forced, that can suddenly introduce a lot of heat very rapidly to the paint. So one of the disadvantages with rotary polishers is the overheating of the clear coat or the paintwork. which causes buffer trails. And now you've seen on cars that have been in dealerships and they've been buffed, and you go around the sun, you see these little hologramic like discs over certain parts of the paint that have been buffed with a rotary polisher. Typically, you can hologram with DAs, but it's harder to do so. Now, the downside with holograms is you won't see them unless you're in strong sunlight, and sometimes you need to wash the car to get all the polishing oils off, or some of them off, before you actually see the holograms. So a lot of people misuse rotary polishers and they don't think they've done anything wrong because it looks good. You know, you go over it, the paint is getting really hot to the touch, but it looks glossy with the polishing oils, and you buff it and they're happy with it. But that's the danger with these. Also on cars, when you go from polishing metal body panels, you know, that have been painted, down to plastic parts that have been painted, the plastic parts can overheat quicker. The paint can be softer because the plastic's softer, and it can be a lot easier to put buffer trails in. So even an experienced guy could be working away, knowing he's at safe speeds, he's not overheating the paintwork, and move to the bumpers and do the same technique, but actually introduce buffer trails. Now, when you introduce buffer trails, it usually happens when you're using aggressive cutting compounds and high speeds. So you're operating this machine very rapidly. Once you do that, it's not the end of the world, because you just finish them out with lower speeds, potentially, with softer media, softer foam pads and finishing polishes, and just refine the paintwork. And that will just instantly take the buffer trails out. Buffer trails aren't a major problem. They're on the surface. They're not a deep kind of defect. They're very easy to correct. So it's not a major problem. The second disadvantage with the rotary, really, and the main other disadvantage, is it feels very uncomfortable the first time you use these machines, and it sits on a panel. If you've been using a dual action polisher where the main movement isn't driven, and you've just got a tiny movement, as soon as this hits the panel, if you're not set for it, it can go flying off, or it can pull you around and you'll be fighting the machine. That disadvantage, you get used to that straight away, and you know how to operate the machine, you know which way it's going to pull you, and you learn to balance the machine so you're not fighting against it. It doesn't take that long to get there, actually. There's all sorts of different techniques with this, depending on what you're doing. If you're taking out sanding marks, you want to probably use a flexible blacking plate, and then use just a bit of an angle on there so you've got a bit more weight, and just you know, work over the sanding mark with a heavy cutting compound. If you want to just use it to detail and cut out defects and stuff like that, yeah, you can use these machines flat on slower speeds and use them a bit more like a dual action where you're using them horizontal. Great for edging. The other great thing about rotaries is they support every type of format of plate. You can go bigger than this 5-inch plate up to a 6-inch plate. You can use a 3-inch plate and use it as a mini. You can even use a 1-inch plate for spot correction, and you can put extension bars on there and put the spot correction pads on there and get in tiny intricate places and reach. So rotary is really the only tool that you can use that does everything. You could really just have this and it would do everything. When you're using the tiny pads, the speeds of these aren't sometimes fast enough compared to little mini polishers which are designed for the 3 to 1-inch pads, but that's splitting the atom. Essentially, you could have this polisher and do anything with it. Some of the other disadvantages, as well as hologramming and getting a feel for the machine, some of the other disadvantages are that this machine is more prone to flinging liquid because of the speed that it spins at. You can place your polish down on the car in a slightly different method. Rather than putting big clumps of polish onto the pad, you can put a line of polish onto the panel and just quickly scoop it up and work the area that you're working in. And once you get the hang of that, you're probably unlikely to sling polish when you're picking it up, but you can still sling it at other times. They're also more prone to dusting out the polish because of that heat that they can tend to generate. Again, though, if you know what you're doing, you can counter that and stop that from happening. But a lot of times they do get used quicker and more aggressively, and they're throwing up dust everywhere. Are there any other disadvantages to the rotary? Well, for me, I think if you're taking out sanding marks, no matter, you know, you hear stories that all of these machines are roughly the same kind of cut capability, but I've found if you're taking out sanding marks or you've done any wet sanding, if you use a rotary with a wall pad and you lean in and you just get a nice pressure point going, that is the quickest way to take sanding marks out, with a wool pad as well. You don't get the stickiness. It doesn't stick to the panel as much with a wool pad, so it's nice and smooth and slidey. Because there's no offset, there's less vibration with this tool on your hand as well, so they're smoother to operate. I don't tend to use them anymore. My problem, why don't I tend to use them? I can get holograms with them. I tend to sling a bit more with them and dust a bit more with them. Yeah, and I just don't tend to use them anymore. But I always have it there because I just think it looks cool. I just like it. It is a cool machine. Now, finally, the forced rotation dual action polisher. Now, essentially, this is a halfway house between the free spinning dual action polisher and the rotary. Mechanically, it's much more similar to the dual action polisher, that it has, in my understanding, because the design of this might have changed, but generally speaking, the forced rotation has a free spinning bearing offset in the main axle. So why isn't this free spinning? Because it runs around a set of gearing or track which stops the free spinning element. It's a bit complicated to describe. Some of you will understand exactly what I've just said there. So as you spin it, if that gearing wasn't there restricting it, it would just be a normal DA, but it isn't. And because it's running the plate around a gearing, the rotation goes the other way by default. So it alters the movement in a different direction. So you'd have to either set your initial axle movement the other way to have a normal clockwise movement, or counterclockwise, if you know what I mean. Now, the advantage of the forced rotation machine is that you're less likely to overheat the paintwork and, you know, put holograms in the paintwork or burn through if you're polishing on raised edges, which can be an increased risk with rotary. You've got those advantages of the dual action where it's the two forms of movement mean that it's not working in one place so much. So it's slightly less aggressive. It's spreading the working load over a different area. The advantage, though, is you will not stop this machine from spinning. Look, see that? If I try and grab that, I'm not going to stop it. So when I've got a little overhanging edge on the front bumper, I can use this and just tee up and go along it, and it's not going to stall out. When there's curves and valleys, it's not going to stall out. When I go to the edge, I can get right into the edge, and I can even just lean in slightly when I'm on that edge and just work a little left and right and then back down your channel. Doing that on the DA, it's not quite as effective. You tend to get less lift on the edges as well with this machine. That's another disadvantage of the free spinning dual action. The lift on the edges means you've got to really do a good 50% chunk of overlap. You can do a little bit less overlap with these, I find, because they don't lift so much. What are the disadvantages? Well, I find it works a pad slightly harder than a dual action polisher, so you have to manage that. It's not a problem at all for me now, but I think, you know, back in the day I didn't really even know that, and I would just work at the same sort of speeds, and you can heat your pad up a little bit more. If the pad's sticking, it will tear through it in seconds, so you've got to make sure your system is all working and you're not getting any problems. The other disadvantage with this is it pulls you slightly. Less noticeably so than the rotary, but it's still rotating and oscillating. So you've still got a little bit of pull when you're changing. You know, if you tilt that way, it'll pull you that way. If you tilt that way, it'll pull you that way, because obviously that's just the way it works. I find that a very minor issue. I don't find these machines pull me around at all. Again, you can compensate it with technique. You might work a little bit with a little bit more compound than you would use with the dual action polisher, just so that it's always nice and loose, a bit wetter on the surface. So it's a bit more kind of, you know, you're less likely to get the product drying up and stiffening up on the pad and then gripping. So you just work around it. So those are your main 3 formats of polisher, okay guys? The golden rule, I think, is I wouldn't recommend you start polishing on a rotary polisher, although, you know, thousands of people all around the world do and have and will recommend rotaries. I just think there's things that can go wrong there that you might as well eliminate. So I would perhaps recommend that you start on a dual action polisher, a free spinning one that is an entry level one like this, and then work your way up. Because like I say, you can just sell them or keep it as a backup tool. If you're a professional, you probably want to start with the Fit Long Throw DA and accompany it with a 3-inch mini DA. Now the next step is cordless tools. When I first saw cordless tools, the price of them really put me off. And I just thought, no, they're not for me. They're not for me. But then I had this cordless tool sitting around here, and every time I needed to do some polishing, I just grabbed it. And after a while, I suddenly realised how handy it was to just literally be able to go like this and start polishing and not have that cable whacking around and treading on the cable, and like the cable gets all the grease and polish on it and picks up dust and dirt, and you've got to coil the cable back up and tuck it in there. Just polish and go. And when I'm working in here, juggling the batteries around, it wasn't a problem for me at all. In fact, I just found it worked really, really well. So I've invested. The downside is of polishing cordless is the batteries are really expensive. About 120 quid these flex batteries are each. They were 100 back when I started. So it's expensive. You need a minimum of 2 batteries really, so you've always got one on charge. We've covered this in other videos, but that's when I think polishing tool manufacturers, if they've got a good suite of products, then they can get you to buy into their system. You know, so you think, oh, like, if I've got all these batteries, I can get their lighting, I can get their blowers, I can get their drills and all that sort of stuff. And then when they bring out new tools that are cordless, they do little deals on them like I've talked about. So I like that. These are toys for me. All these tools are toys. I don't play with my Star Wars or my He-Man anymore. So I get excited when tool manufacturers bring out tools. So I think it's a good thing. You have really there all the essential information on what you need. The key thing to remember really is that your liquid abrasive that you put onto your pad is the thing really that's slicing the clear coats, removing clear coat off of the car. These machines and your pad are just the tools for moving that abrasive on the surface, okay? Your pad choice does matter. You've got wool, microfiber, foam. When you're starting out, I would recommend you go with foam. After that, you can explore microfiber and wool. Sometimes wool is the best option to cut for me, especially on the rotary. But even now on these formats, wool really seems to get a good bite on that panel. But traditionally, and even so today, wool won't finish down as well as foam. So some professionals will want to take the most extreme cutting approach, which could be wool and a high cut compound, and then the most extreme finishing approach, which would be an ultra fine finishing polish and a soft pad, and they'll do a 2-stage. So maximize your cut, maximize your gloss, you get the maximum amount of results for a 2-stage. If you're doing a single stage polish, which is lots of guys at home and lots of detailers that have only got a day or half a day, most often than not, you're going to be using a single stage abrasive and a foam pad. But wool and microfiber have come a long way now that they can get close. So it comes down to personal preference. Personal preference for me is most of the time it's foam. Every now and then, if it's like a really swirled up, horrible, hard German paint, I'll cut it with wool and finish it with foam if that's quickest. I don't tend to use microfiber. I find some argue it's the best of both worlds, but I think it might not be the best of either, but a sort of compromise that can do a bit of both. But there you go, it's all personal preference. Have some fun. I hope this video helps you get a starting point on where to go. And we've covered all the information, all of the tooling that's been in this on this video, brains shutting down, I'll put in the description. Take care, see you soon. There's those other ones. There's the long throw and the mini cordless. There's all different brands as well. We're not really talking so much about brands, more about formats and stuff like that in this video. And there's your one that most people are going to be using. Adios.